Hello, I'm Michael from Rapid SOS, and we're excited today to have an interesting discussion about school safety's digital transformation. In 2022, there were more school shootings than any year since Columbine, and I think it just breaks all of our hearts seeing how our communities have been impacted by this challenge. So I'm excited to bring together three of the leading experts on that topic today to talk about how does this work for the different aspects of that for 911 agencies, for field responders, for our school administrators, and how can technology help in these moments that matter most? So let me start by just doing quick introductions. So very excited to have with me, all the way on the right here, Commander John Alish, who helps train field responders on how directly do you manage these major incidents. So thank you, John, for joining us.
Thank you.
Also excited to have the Executive Director of JeffCom 911 and a former police chief himself, Jeff Streeter. Thank you, Jeff, for joining us today. And then David Rogers, right here to my right, the Chief Marketing Officer and Head of Government Affairs for Raptor Technologies, which is one of the largest school safety vendors globally, over 54,000 schools. And I just want to get right into it since we have tight time today. So, Jeff, I know that you were there that terrible day with Columbine. Can you take us a little bit into what was that like?
Well, I wouldn't even know where to necessarily begin. Horrific day, one of the worst tragedies as far as school shootings went, although we're seeing that change as time's going forward. The events of that day involved, at one point in time, 1,000 police officers responded to that event. And if you could imagine the phone calls and the data, using systems that were absolutely incapable of processing locations. These calls flooded ECCs, emergency communication centers. Centers had to flow over to other centers, and you're trying to populate that data and that information. I was a SWAT sergeant responsible for an entry team at Columbine High School, and information came piecemealed at best, came delayed at best, sometimes quite outdated at times, but it was how that information was transfolding into it. Cell phones were just coming of age. They existed, but they not to the capabilities of our iOS systems or other platforms right now. We couldn't identify, the dispatch centers couldn't identify where students were calling from, where teachers were calling from. We had false calls coming from well outside the school that couldn't be discerned back to a location base. But again, systems were flooded. And these centers at this point in time were incapable of processing data. So for us and inside the school, it just came in bits and pieces. And we were chasing, at times, very stale information as we were moving through the school.
Yeah. It's, I think all of us just continuing to see these incidents unfold, it just breaks our hearts. And I know, John, like you've been on the front line on equipping and training our first responders on how do we manage these circumstances? So what is the latest thinking on that? Like, how are you training America's first responders to manage these sorts of tragedies?
Yeah, so we really have three primary goals in any one of these. And this is, unfortunately, we have learned from Columbine. We continue to learn from Columbine. We learned a lot from the tragedy in Uvalde and where, frankly, law enforcement systems failed to deal with the problems that were occurring. So as recently as a year ago, we were debriefing that incident and saying, where were the failure points and how do we ensure that we continue that forward momentum when we know we need to? And so as we look at these different events and what we can learn from them, really there's three areas we look at. The first thing we always have to do is stop the threat. It has to start with that, because if we don't do that, the problems and the tragedy will continue regardless of what else we do. So that's primary. The second is we have to stop the dying. And that's one thing that we've seen a transformation in law enforcement recently in years is you would be surprised how much medical equipment our police officers carry now and how much training we have. Because we know that just because the shooter has been stopped, that doesn't mean that people aren't still dying. And so we're training our first responders to get in there, especially our cops, and get those initial steps taken care of to ensure that we get more people home. And the final piece is rapid casualty evacuation. And that's where, as we talk today, I think those last two, police can handle the stop the threat piece. And we'll talk about how some digital technology and information is so key to that, but especially the latter two. the ability to get people fixed up and sent out to definitive care is huge. And the more info we have on that, the better.
Yeah, interesting. I think so often we just think about step one, and there's a whole component of steps 2 and 3 that obviously are critical to managing the incident. David, you work with 54,000 schools, globally, and talk to us, like, how are our administrators thinking about this sort of problem? And then I definitely want to dig in and learn a little bit more about how your technology is working to address those challenges.
It's actually more than that now. It's actually 60,000, so we're continuing to grow. Yeah, so when you look at it from a school's point of view, it's very different sometimes than law enforcement. And actually getting those two groups to talk has been part of the challenge. They know they need technology. They know they need, particularly since a lot of states are now mandating to put things in place like panic alert technology. They know they need to implement it, but how is it implemented? How do they work with law enforcement? How do they get it connected back to get that contextual information that you're talking about, which is, the location, what type of emergency is it? Active shooter events occur, but they're also still kind of rare. So the things that usually happen at schools are evacuations, or you've got the police chasing somebody, a bank robber across the campus. So it might be a secure. So how do you provide context? And then how do you get the right information? If it's an evacuation, should that really be going out to the fire department? If it's a lockdown, it probably should be going to the police. So one of the things that Raptor does is we really get in there and we try to bridge that gap. And that's one of the things that we've been able to do with Rapid SOS, is we've been able to partner with you guys to help bring in the answering points, to help bring in law enforcement, so we can close that big gap that has occurred out there that's been, because it's just not natural usually for school districts to work with the police departments and the sheriff departments and 911.
Yeah. And I'm struck by kind of, what you were talking about, David, and then Jeff, where you started, which is like just the volume of calls, information flooding in. And obviously 911 starts out as the nexus for that information. So you spent all this time leading law enforcement, and then you transitioned to lead one of the largest 911 agencies in Colorado. How are you thinking about equipping your team in that function, for God forbid, some sort of active shooter event?
Sure. Well, the training's critical for us as well, as much as it is for law enforcement. Ongoing training for our call takers to discern, first and foremost, to the best of their ability, location, so we can direct the appropriate resources to it. What is the contextual information that we can provide? Is it weapons? Is it suspect location, suspect descriptors? Or are we dealing with victims, and where are the victims located throughout these tragedies? So we do a lot of training ourselves, and they attend ongoing classes. It is system overload for them, and it doesn't take long for a 911 center to be overwhelmed. 2 weeks ago, there was a tragic event up in Maine. I can only imagine in a smaller community, that system was overwhelmed. How it fell out, or how long it took for them to process through the volumes of calls they got from dual locations. The same thing happens in a school shooting. Columbine at the point in time in '99 had over 2,000 students. Well, you not only have the students involved or in the school that have critical information, but now you have parents and everybody else that are calling 911 in a time of tragedy looking for their kids. So how do you keep those calls over here, and we're en route, and how do we get first responders directed to exactly where the event is? And location is critical for us, because I think we can pinpoint resources differently.
Yeah. I'm struck again by another tragic example of this. My wife is a physician, and she did her training in Las Vegas, and she was in training during that tragic day.
Yes.
And if you read the after action report, obviously incredible work by law enforcement to manage an incredibly complicated situation, but the volume of calls, the chaos, and even, in a situation where for the field responders trying to figure out where was the shooter, there were, reports coming in everywhere, and setting up the right radio channels, getting all that organized, it was just a massive amount of work to do in minutes, right? So John, take us through, let's spend 1 minute more on kind of that first step, which is stopping the incident, okay? So One of the, I think, powerful examples that we saw recently was Metro Police in Nashville dealing with the Covenant school shooting. And amazing to see how law enforcement rushed into that building. But also, if you watch the body cam footage, which was all released, is it was a maze. You know, like they have no idea what they're walking into. Where is the shooter? And I was struck by just listening for gunshots and trying to figure it out. So if David's connecting all those schools and he has all the sensors and he has the camera feeds and he knows how many students are there, like how could we make that useful for your teams running into these situations?
Yeah, so I think that's probably where I'm most excited for the future and what groups like this can bring together to work together, right? So you mentioned it's like a maze. And what I would challenge anyone out here who's watching right now is imagine being told, I want you to go into a 200,000 square foot building that the architecture makes no sense to you or anyone else, and I want you to find someone who needs your help in an emergency. And you're right, so there are keys that we train on, right? We call it looking for stimulus, and the stimuli can be gunshots, it can be screaming, it can be anything like that. So we're trained for that. But some of these schools, we have a school in Lakewood that spans like 10 football fields. Wow. And so you may go into an empty sounding building. And the other thing, one thing first responders often comment on when they go into school shootings is lockdowns are eerily silent because the kids are doing what they need to do to stay safe. They are sheltering in place in their classroom, lights off, and everyone is silent. So now you have a cop walking into a room that's completely silent and they're going, where do I go? And that's where I think the real future can be, is in the moment, I can't be looking at my phone when I'm running with a gun. We know that. But if I get in a school and I go, I have no idea where to go. And I can take that minute, whether it's through an app or something, and if I could say, I'm here, and the person who called this in is here. And I'm able to use that to guide me. And at least I know then I'm on the south side of this huge building. The problem's on the north side, I need to move. Just that hasty plan may make all the difference in the world.
Yeah, and like that, so Jeff, like what's interesting, right, in these situations, as John pointed out, right, is your team has to be totally focused in that moment. You know, you can't be in front of a screen or anything like that. Your team is there getting all this information, flooding in. Like, how do we take potentially David's insight that we have a assailant that's on the second floor in the main atrium and get that into your hands in a way that is usable and actionable?
I think it's working with the school districts. I think it is transferring data into our CAD systems. I think it's still heavily based on the training that we provide for our call takers and our dispatchers. These dispatchers sitting in front of this, if they're on a primary channel, the notes alone are horrific to try to read through and discern who's doing what and who's where, right? How do we capture those moments and what data can streamline it to where it's coming in as either an addition to it, an attachment, if you will, that we can focus there. I think critically for the first responders, you know, I did SWAT for 15 years. I don't have time to look at my phone, either as an entry person, a sergeant, but as a commander, when I was a SWAT commander in a command post, I'm in a different environment and I can set up these data points. So I should become that conduit to my team that are inside and providing that critical information. I don't know that the first responders are gonna have time to map it. They're driving to these calls with their hair on fire. They're not even probably even looking at their MDCs. What can the dispatcher give them? How timely is that? How much data points coming out of Raptor would it be? Then it's got to set up, probably in about the next 10, 15 minutes, that command post starts taking shape. And they can start processing more and more information. You're trained to move to the sound. What you see, what you smell, what you hear, those are the senses that we've trained to. It's dynamic, it's changing. It's forever changing. And you take these scenes that where you go multiple scenes, game changer.
And I think, Jeff, you bring up a good point, and that's where what's so key is that as first responders, we have to rely on our dispatchers.
Absolutely.
And one thing I love about Rapid SOS and this is you're not trying to cut anyone out. We're recognizing that there's so much value in those professionals in that dispatch center that have the training, have the ability to comb through that information and get what they need to those first responders. they are our lifeline to the information that will help us help people. And so that's really a key as we move forward in any way to improve this.
That common operating picture that you're trying to create, right? I mean, that's where the Raptor app really comes in, because we are generating all this contextual information, right? Not only what type of event is it, right? What type of emergency, but also there's a live chat going on. That could be providing information. We share maps between each other. So while they may not have the ability to look at it on the run, they're also not going to know where door 201 is either, right? So they'll probably want to utilize a grid technology. Well, the teachers aren't going to be familiar with that, but if it's right there on the app and they can look at it and say, hey, we're in grid A1, it's going to make that much easier for the police to respond. So that sharing of information through the technology and creating that common operating picture for everybody to work off of, the people in the school, 911, the responding of cops, it's going to make a huge difference in reducing the amount of seconds that it takes to deal with the threat and then get to those that are hurting.
So what I'm hearing a little bit is actionable data directly from the scene, which is something that you all have studied a lot on, right? And then Jeff, for you, it's, again, the most relevant information inside your existing systems that you're using, right? And where relevant, streamed out to the commander in the field. And then John, for your team that's actually making entry, it is just the most important pieces of information, primarily guided around where is the threat, so we can stop that point number one. So let's talk now kind of steps 2 and 3. So now we have, God forbid, a set of victims that need immediate EMS care. So how does that work? So we just ended, hopefully, a live threat situation. Take us through what happens next, and maybe Jeff or John will hand it to you to.
Yeah, so the way we train it now, and one thing we do when we're teaching is, beyond teaching the first responders, especially the cops, how to solve the problem, is the next thing we're doing is identifying how do we get law enforcement and firefighter and EMS assets to work together in concert to, like I said, stop the dying next, right? And so we battle track that in a few ways, where we say, okay, we have a member of the police department and a member of the fire department on site, and they're sometimes writing on the walls, right? We say, have a Sharpie and write on the wall. Yeah, the janitor can get it off later, right? But we're writing on the walls, and as first responders are going through the school, they may be calling out, hey, there's 3 injured in room 202. There's 3 injured in this one. There's 2 injuries in the hallway, and they're having to track that. But that's a lot of data, right? And that's where Jeff brought up the command center. The law enforcement and fire representatives on scene and the command center can work together to distill it down and say, okay, where in this scene do we know that we have casualties, or where could that bad actor have gone? And we need to check those areas. So tracking those points are so key to knowing where we need to go.
And then I imagine, when we've studied some of these recent incidents, it's not like the 911 calls stop.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
So Jeff, what's going on, at Jeff Com in a scenario like this? Walk us through.
It's a team effort. We are a large center. So we have the luxury of having a lot of resources, but in the right incident or wrong incident, it can overwhelm a large center as well. So we're a suburb of Denver. And so our calls, if we overflow, they go to Denver's. If Denver overflows, they come to us. We're the 2 largest PSAPs. So we can help each other, and we can exchange information as timely as possible. But that was going on in '99 as well, because the sheriff's department was the primary PSAP. They became overwhelmed, calls fell into Lakewood. And it was different. Systems weren't talking to systems like they do today. So that information was slow in developing, okay? When you talk about the injuries and trying to address those became critical. For my team inside, we had to move past kids that were injured. We had to have other kids help kids get out of the school. So some young kids had to grow up pretty quickly to help injured out of that school. And so you're tasking them to try to get them in the arms of safety. So much has gone into that with tactical EMS units, now training law enforcement and different capability. But it has, all this information has to be in concert, as he said, and come together. And we are working from different channels. I said 1,000 officers responded to Columbine. Well, that's multiple agencies on disparate systems. And you can't bring them back then. We couldn't bring them together for interoperability. Interoperability is critical for any agencies, whether you're rural or urban. That interoperability is absolutely hypercritical.
Yeah.
Because then we can start exchanging information via radio as well.
That from a school standpoint, I want to build on that because one of the most critical things you can do is practice. And there's a district in Texas that we work with, Midlothian, and Commander Hicks there is famous for his drills. We also do a lot of things around reunification on the back end, right? Because kids want to get parents want to get their kids back as fast as possible. And that's actually one of those things you don't always think about, right? But it plays into everything you're saying. But one of the things he does, he actually last year did a simulated active shooter event at a high school football game, which in Texas, right? I mean, it's all about football, right? And so, but he brought in every responding agency down to the corner and the justice of the peace who has to pronounce somebody dead, right? And we went through the whole process, right? We had kid actors there. We had 50 kids who had been dropped off by their parents that had to be reunified. Actually, Raptor has what we call an accountability. So you're able to say, yeah, here's this kid, you're able to give a status, they're accounted for, or they're injured, or they're deceased. And so they utilize that technology for the incident commander so that they could have that same picture of what was going on with those folks there. And they practice it. And then afterwards, we did a hot wash. We all sat down with some Chick-fil-A and we all talked through it, every agency, and the EMS guys raised up their hands and said, we weren't on the same comms as you guys. We had no idea what was going on. And so if you don't go through that process and have the schools involved in it and see what really goes on for an event, they're not going to wrap their heads around it. So we really encourage that you do these not only just practice an active assailant, somebody being in a school, but also the back end of it. How do you handle the casualties? How do you handle accounting for everybody? How do you reunify the kids back with their parents when you've had an incident?
So I think this brings to the third point that you brought up, John, on the reunification side of it. So I think what's exciting is hearing about how there's tools inside Raptor, and my understanding of it is like Raptor's even like these schools are even managing attendance and stuff as well. So who's in that building, right? Guest registration?
All the visitors, all the volunteers, that all pops up because you want to know who's all in that school, right? When y'all show up, because you don't know who the shooter is, right? So you want to be able to account for everybody there.
So digitally now, if it's one of your schools, everyone who's in the building, who's a student, who's a guest, and after the fact, we can use that software to account for, who is safe, who's unaccounted for, who's injured perhaps.
Correct. And we were talking about it earlier. When bullets are flying, you're probably not taking accountability, right? But when you are post-incident, when y'all dealt with the active incident piece of it, you are able to utilize that software. And you are, imagine a parent, and I always think of Parkland. They were at 2 a.m. at that hotel that was a reunification site trying to figure out where the kids were. How much better it would have been if they had been able to do that accountability, have a dashboard, know which parents they had to talk to, which ones were going down the happy path, which ones weren't, right? And so that's so critical to be able to put that in play. Once again, when the bullets are flying, you're probably not sitting there doing a checklist of kids, but there's a lot of other incidents, like evacuations, like a chemical spill or a fire or whatever, where you are taking that accountability. And then also going to the reunification site as you're loading kids on bus. I'm thinking about Mansfield when they had a shooting situation in Texas. They were loading the kids on the bus. You got to take attendance on the bus. You got to get them to the reunification site. You got to know who's there, who's not there. You don't want a guardian showing up or somebody showing up that doesn't have guardianship and doing a parental abduction, taking bad advantage of a bad situation. And if you think of a reunification, it's like if you've got 500 kids in the school, there's 1,500 people going to show up to pick that kid up. I mean, it's like putting on a small concert. So you're going to have to practice with law enforcement how they respond, how you deal with traffic. They can't go to the same bathrooms. You got to have water for everybody. It's a lot that goes into it. So having the tools that make that go faster and easier, and also help you understand where you need to send parents, it's very critical.
Yeah, I'm thinking, Jeff, you were talking about just the tragedy out of Maine, and unfortunately, so often these incidents aren't just over. Sometimes they extend, and I was in grad school in Boston, and in the Boston bombing, there was this multi-day manhunt. There was actually a shootout with law enforcement. It was actually in the building that I lived in at the time downstairs at this gas station that was underneath the building. And so unfortunately, right, like these situations are not clean, right? Like they get complicated, they're messy, et cetera. So hearing knowing John and Jeff that David knows who was there, who are all the kids, who are the visitors that had signed in, et cetera. Like, how is that helpful in those sorts of situations?
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, either way, we have a responsibility to reunite those kids back to that. And I'm going to take a step out of schools for a minute. In any business, we're seeing this occur in a multitude of facets of society. Law enforcement still has a responsibility to keep people safe, reunite them with family, loved ones. So this can expand beyond schools.
Pinellas County is actually looking at it right now.
Sadly, we learn lessons from every one of these, and it's critical for us to have that. This is a crime scene. So we have to rebuild that crime scene. So us having a class list, us having who's in the school at the time, helps us reestablish where witnesses could be and how we take shape to put a case together. And that's the outcome. I mean, we're after a disposition. If it doesn't end in the demise of the suspect, we've got to put together a viable case to present for effective prosecution. And what the data that comes out of these systems helps build that. We have learned lessons from every shooting, and Columbine was not the first. I've been some role in 4 different school shootings. Some role, way, shape, or form, 4 school shootings in Colorado I've taken part in. Lessons learned out of every one of those. There'll be lessons learned from Maine as much as they are Uvalde. I mean, we learn across the board, and it's always dynamic and it's changing.
Every time.
Your technology and Rapid SOS technology, Raptor both, will change in the next year. We just know it will. It's going to adapt to more need base for law enforcement to be even much more effective.
Yep.
I think, as I talk through kind of my 3 areas of need, the first one is the most trying, but it's also the simplest. We need to find someone who's causing harm and stop them from committing harm. When we talk from a command post perspective, if I'm the incident commander on a school shooting, when we enter that reunification phase and that phase where that's the monster. That's the elephant that we now have to eat piece by piece. Because now we're talking about, we have victims and we have witnesses, but we also have kids who we don't want to continually re-victimize by making this process harder. We don't want parents to be waiting hours to see their child, right? And so that's where the power really comes in, because if Raptor has partnered with our school district, and our school district is equipped to now be the best partner possible to that command post, and say, I'm not bringing you old school sheets that we think is right, and probably half the kids aren't in the room. This is today's data. This is who logged in this morning in class. And we had 6 people who left early, so we know they're fine. They had to go off to a dentist appointment or whatever, they got picked up early. That data makes the school district the best partner in the world to that command post, because then they can work off actionable data that's relevant and timely, and we're not chasing ghosts, right? And so as we look forward, that's where the work really starts, is the aftermath. And with this kind of partnership and the ability to have dispatch have the right information, that makes it so much easier. And that means we're getting kids back to their families sooner. That means we're getting parents to the hospital to see their kids sooner. And unfortunately, if there are victims, that means we're getting parents counseling and everything they need to now deal with the most unspeakable tragedy they could imagine, but we're there with them through that process. So I think that's the real power of the data moving forward.
Well, I really like such an important topic and conversation. And one of the exciting things is the work that we've done together and with thousands of public safety officials across the United States to figure out how do we embed all this new technology from companies like Raptor. And you'll hear today from a few other folks working in school safety. So there's now over a dozen different technology companies that do video AI weapon detection, emergency panic buttons, 3D indoor mapping, all this data inside Rapid SOS at the fingertips of public safety, and really built with your feedback, your insights, and your expertise over the last decade. As a father of a 2-year-old, I just want to say thank you to the 3 of you. Like, it's really important work, and the amount of dedication that you've shown to it is going to make a big difference. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.